Florida gets the credit for sinkholes and sewage floods, but Michigan has spent the last 100 years quietly building a different kind of reputation, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. Today, I'm counting down 12 Michigan towns with the receipts to back up why people avoid them. A utility company that physically tore streetlights out of the ground and left a city in the dark for over a decade. A neighborhood of 4,000 people that got bulldozed for a car factory that shut down anyway. 3 psychiatric patients who each believed they were Jesus Christ, housed in the same room on purpose. Number 2 on this countdown is going to catch you off guard because it isn't a rough neighborhood at all. It's one of the wealthiest, most photographed suburbs in the entire Midwest, and what's buried underneath the landscaping is uglier than almost anything else on this list. Some of these towns you've probably driven through without knowing any of this. Others are places locals still argue about at the dinner table decades after the fact. Subscribe if you're new because this channel breaks down the best and worst places to live in America every week. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching this from. Let's get into it. Number 12, Ecorse. Ecorse sits on the Detroit River just south of the city, the kind of small industrial town most people only see as a highway sign on the way somewhere else. During Prohibition, though, it was the site of one of the strangest smuggling setups in American history. Canada sat directly across the water, legally distilling whiskey the entire time alcohol was banned in the U.S., and Detroit's Purple Gang built an empire moving it across the river. In September of 1929, federal customs agents uncovered something that still sounds made up: an underwater tramway, a submerged cable rig running along the riverbed from Mud Island straight into Ecorse, quietly ferrying cases of Canadian whiskey beneath the surface where patrol boats had no way of spotting it. For a stretch of years, this small town was running its own covert underwater smuggling line, one small piece of a much larger operation, since researchers estimate roughly 3/4 of all illegal liquor entering the United States during Prohibition crossed the Detroit River corridor in one form or another. Decades later, Ecorse made headlines for the opposite kind of problem. By 1986, the city was $6 million in debt, and a state court took the unprecedented step of appointing an outside receiver named Louis Schimmel to run its finances directly, the first Michigan town in history to lose control of its own budget that way. The receivership lasted 4 years, until 1990, before the city was handed back control of its own checkbook. A town clever enough to run whiskey past federal agents underwater couldn't keep its own books balanced above the surface. It wouldn't be the last Michigan town to lose its grip on something that mattered. The next one lost something far harder to get back. Number 11, Jackson. Jackson built its whole identity around a wall. Michigan opened its first state prison here in 1839. A wooden fort holding 35 inmates, and the town grew up around it, eventually becoming the busiest railroad stop between Chicago and Detroit, largely because of prison traffic. By 1882, that original facility held more than 2,000 men and was officially recognized as the largest walled prison on the planet. It closed in 1920 once overcrowding made it clear Jackson needed something bigger, and the state authorized a replacement 3 miles north, the State Prison of Southern Michigan, built with capacity for 5,700 inmates. For a second time, Jackson claimed the title of world's largest walled prison, and this version lasted even longer than the first. For most of the 20th century, that was simply what Jackson was known for. 40-foot walls, guard towers on every corner, a highway, barely half a mile long that existed for no other purpose than to connect the outside world to the front gate. Locals used to joke that for anyone forced to walk it, it was effectively the longest road in the world. Then, In May of 1981, it fell apart. A massive riot tore through the facility, one of several hitting Michigan prisons that month, and it took a 9-member state task force just to assess what was left standing afterward. The prison was eventually split into smaller, separately managed facilities by the late 80s, but Jackson never fully shook the identity it had spent a century and a half building. This is a town whose economy, skyline, and reputation were shaped entirely by confinement. Confinement, in one form or another, keeps showing up on this list because the next entry didn't lock anyone behind bars. It locked an entire school system out of its own building. Number 10, Muskegon Heights. By 2012, Muskegon Heights Public Schools was hemorrhaging $18,000 a day just to keep the lights on. The district had lost a third of its enrollment since 2006, and its deficit had climbed past $9 million with no realistic path to closing the gap. The state stepped in, appointed an emergency manager, and did something almost no one saw coming. He fired the entire staff in one move, every teacher, every aide, every support worker, and handed the whole district to a for-profit charter company called Mosaica Education. People who'd worked there for over a decade found out through a form letter they were told to sign together. Within months, investigators discovered more than 1 in 10 of the newly hired charter teachers weren't even certified to teach in Michigan, a violation serious enough to threaten the operator's own contract, worth close to $9 million over 5 years. One laid-off special education aide, who'd spent 15 years with the district, described the layoff notice as a single letter with everyone's name on it. Something every employee was made to sign together on their way out the door. For a community that was already among the poorest in the state, the message landed hard. Even control over your kids' education could vanish overnight. It took more than a decade, and an eventual state debt forgiveness deal worth tens of millions of dollars before Muskegon Heights could operate as a normal public school district again. Losing a school system is one kind of collapse. Losing control of your own streets is another, and our next town has been fighting that battle for years. Number 9, Saginaw. Saginaw used to run on Buick engine plants and steady manufacturing paychecks passed down through generations. When those plants scaled back, they took the town's economic backbone with them. And what's left is a set of crime statistics researchers keep flagging year after year. A 2025 ranking from real estate research firm Realpha put Saginaw residents' odds of becoming a violent crime victim at roughly 1 in 39, with an assault rate close to 1,800 incidents per 100,000 people and a murder rate above 40 per 100,000. Among the highest of any similarly sized city in the state. Drive through parts of Saginaw today, and you can still see the outline of the city it used to be. Solid brick homes, wide tree-lined streets, the architecture of a genuinely handsome Midwestern town sitting under decades of disinvestment. The people who stay aren't blind to the numbers. They just don't accept that the numbers are the whole story. Not every dangerous chapter on this list involves gunfire, though. Sometimes the danger wears a badge, and our next entry learned that from both directions at once. Number 8, Inkster. On the night of July 9th, 1987, 3 Inkster police officers were ambushed and killed inside a rundown motel on Michigan Avenue. Ira Parker, Daniel Dubiel, and Clay Hoover died in an attack that remains one of the deadliest single incidents against law enforcement in Michigan history, and to this day, no one has ever been charged. Nearly 3 decades later, Inkster made headlines again, but this time, the violence ran the other way. In January of 2015, an officer nicknamed RoboCop was caught on camera beating a motorist named Floyd Dent, So severely, the city eventually paid $1.37 million to settle the resulting lawsuit. Days after that settlement, a second victim of the same officer, choked and beaten unconscious during an unrelated 2011 arrest, settled his own case for another $100,000. The city had to impose a special tax on residents just to cover the payouts. Buried underneath all of that is a detail almost nobody connects to this town anymore. Inkster was home to Malcolm X's family during part of his early life, decades before his activism reshaped American history, a piece of the town's story that rarely makes it into the headlines about violence from both sides of the law. When the people meant to protect a town become part of what makes it dangerous, trust doesn't erode slowly. It disappears. And in the next entry, an entire city lost something even more basic than trust: the ability to see after dark. Number 7. Highland Park. By 2011, Highland Park owed DTE Energy $4 million in unpaid electric bills. Instead of letting the debt keep growing, city officials struck a deal that sounds almost fictional when you say it out loud. DTE agreed to forgive the balance, and in return, the utility physically removed 1,400 streetlights from the city, pulling bulbs, poles, and wiring straight out of the ground. 2/3 of the town's lighting disappeared almost overnight, dropping from 1,600 working streetlights to fewer than 500. DTE did install about 200 newer, more efficient replacement lights at major intersections and corners as part of the deal, but that left most residential side streets completely unlit, which is exactly where residents say the fear lives. This wasn't a town that had always struggled either. Highland Park's population had fallen to fewer than 12,000 people by the time the lights went dark, roughly half of what it had been just 2 decades earlier, and the city was carrying a reported $58 million in overall debt on top of the DTE bill. Residents describe walking their kids to the bus stop through total darkness, keeping them indoors after sunset purely out of instinct, entire blocks lit by nothing but porch bulbs and passing headlights. A local nonprofit called Solidarity formed specifically because of it, installing community-owned solar streetlights one pole at a time since the city itself could no longer be counted on to keep the power running. The mayor at the time insisted crime hadn't gone up because of the darkness. Residents standing in their own unlit driveways at night weren't convinced. Highland Park lost its light over a debt to an energy company. Our next entry is still paying off a debt to the air itself. Number 6. River Rouge. If you've ever driven the Detroit River south of downtown, you've seen Zug Island without knowing its name. A heavily industrialized stretch packed with steel processing and coke ovens glowing faintly against the night sky. In February of 2025, a federal judge ordered DTE Energy to pay a $100 million penalty over the excessive air pollution coming out of its coke battery plant there, one of the largest sulfur dioxide emitters in the entire state, releasing an estimated 3,600 tons of the pollutant into the air in a single recent year. The plant runs 85 separate ovens, heating coal in an oxygen-free chamber until it becomes coke for the steel industry. And the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency had already issued a formal notice of violation back in 2020, years before the case finally reached a judge. The judge didn't stop at the fine. He also ordered DTE into compliance with Federal Clean Air Act standards and required the company to fund a $20 million community air quality committee for residents who've been breathing this air for generations. Environmental advocates called it a rare win for a community that had been fighting industrial pollution with very little to show for it for decades. River Rouge lives in the shadow of that island every single day. a small town sandwiched between a global steel supply chain and its own lungs. If River Rouge is a story about a community fighting for the ground beneath its feet, the next entry is about a community that lost the ground entirely. Number 5. Hamtramck and the vanished neighborhood of Poletown. In 1981, General Motors wanted a new assembly plant, and it wanted that plant built on the border of Detroit and Hamtramck, on 465 acres occupied by a dense working-class Polish immigrant neighborhood called Poletown. The cities agreed to use eminent domain, and the Michigan Supreme Court signed off on it. What followed became one of the largest single neighborhood demolitions in American urban history. Roughly 4,200 residents were forced out, 1,300 homes were leveled, 140 businesses closed for good. 6 churches, including a beloved parish called Immaculate Conception, came down along with a hospital. A group of holdout residents barricaded themselves inside that church in a final protest before it fell too. The plant that replaced all of it opened in 1985, ran for over 3 decades, and then in 2018, General Motors announced it was closing anyway. Hamtramck's mayor put it plainly to reporters at the time: the city destroyed homes, churches, and businesses to build that plant. And now people are left wondering why any of it had to be sacrificed in the first place. In an odd final twist, the same factory footprint reopened a few years later under a new name, Factory Zero, now building electric pickup trucks with fewer than 1,000 employees on the very ground where thousands once lived. If losing a neighborhood is a wound to a town's body, the next entry is a wound to its mind. Because in 1959, one Michigan hospital ran an experiment that still unsettles psychologists today. Number 4. Ypsilanti. On July 1, 1959, at Ypsilanti State Hospital, social psychologist Milton Rouge brought together 3 paranoid schizophrenic patients who shared one identical, unshakable delusion. Each man was completely convinced he was Jesus Christ. Clyde Benson was an elderly farmer. Joseph Cassell was a failed writer. Leon Gabor was a college dropout and war veteran. Rouge's theory was that confronting each man with 2 other people making the exact same impossible claim might trigger a psychological break severe enough to shake the delusion loose. Instead, for 2 full years, the 3 men lived, ate, and argued together, each one adjusting his own story, just enough to explain away the other 2 rather than surrender his identity. One eventually decided the other 2 must be dead men being operated like machines. It became one of the most studied and most ethically questioned experiments in the history of American psychiatry. Rouge published the full account in 1964 as a book, and the story proved strange enough to keep resurfacing decades later, adapted into a stage play, 2 separate operas, and eventually a feature film released in 2020. Ypsilanti's hospital walls once held an experiment about how far the human mind will bend before it breaks. The next entry is about a different kind of breaking point. What happens when the water coming out of your own faucet has been quietly working against you for years? If you're still here, this list only gets heavier from this point forward. Go ahead and subscribe now if you haven't, because we've still got a religious colony hiding a decades-long scandal, a suburb with a real estate secret that'll change how you see it, and the single heaviest entry on this entire countdown still ahead. Number 3. Benton Harbor. Benton Harbor carries 2 separate legacies, and they're dark for completely different reasons. In 1903, a preacher named Benjamin Purnell and his wife Mary arrived in town and founded a religious colony called the House of David, claiming Purnell was a divine messenger, continuing a line of prophecy stretching back over a century. At its peak, the community had more than 1,000 members who handed over their homes, savings, and possessions in exchange for a promised paradise on Earth. They built an amusement park, ran a wildly popular traveling baseball team known for long beards and genuinely serious talent, and constructed elegant mansions from their own custom-poured cement blocks, some of which still stand today and are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. For a while, it looked like a thriving utopian experiment. Then, in the 1920s, the truth surfaced. Purnell was accused of sexually abusing dozens of girls and women inside the colony, a scandal that split the community permanently and never fully allowed it to recover its reputation. A century later, Benton Harbor found itself in an entirely different crisis. Starting in 2018, water testing repeatedly showed lead levels well above the federal safety threshold year after year, in a town where nearly half the population lives below the poverty line. It took 3 full years of documented contamination before Michigan's governor finally ordered an accelerated 18-month timeline to replace lead service lines, a pace regulators admitted usually takes decades to achieve. Residents lined up before sunrise for bottled water, warned not to cook, drink, or mix baby formula with what came out of their own taps. A town that once promised paradise through faith spent a century later fighting for something as basic as water that wouldn't hurt its own children. And residents there openly compared their own fight to what Flint had already been through, wondering out loud why the same mistake could happen twice in one state within a matter of years. And speaking of things hidden beneath a beautiful surface, our number 2 entry is about to change how you look at one of Michigan's most picture-perfect suburbs. Number 2, Grosse Pointe. I told you this one would surprise you, and I stand by that completely. Grosse Pointe is old money. Waterfront estates, English manor architecture, some of the highest property values anywhere in Michigan, sitting just 10 miles from downtown Detroit. For decades, local real estate brokers here use something called the Pointe system, a formal numeric scorecard applied to every prospective homebuyer. Investigators assessed a buyer's appearance, accent, last name, and background, then assigned a score. Fall below the threshold for being Black, Jewish, Italian, Polish, or otherwise deemed undesirable, and no amount of money would get you a house here. The whole system came to light because a man named John Maxwell filed suit trying to dissolve an agreement he'd made with local property brokers, and the case dragged the Pointe system into public view for the first time. In 1960, Michigan's own Attorney General publicly called the practice morally corrupt after that lawsuit exposed exactly how the scoring worked, and the system was formally dismantled that same year under public pressure. But ending a policy and undoing its results are two very different things. 57 years later, a researcher examining her own hometown found that Detroit remained 85% Black, while Grosse Pointe sat at 95% white. With a median household income more than 3 times higher on the Grosse Pointe side of a line you could walk across in under a minute. You can cross a single street here and feel decades of engineered inequality without seeing a single wall or sign anywhere. It isn't crime, poverty, or pollution that puts Grosse Pointe on this list. It's the fact that a place this quiet, this manicured, this exclusive built that exclusivity by design. Now, let's get to the town where water, race, industry, and government failure all collided at once and left a wound this country still hasn't finished dealing with. Number 1, Flint. In April of 2014, under the direction of a state-appointed emergency manager, Flint switched its drinking water source from Lake Huron to the Flint River as a cost-cutting measure. Residents complained almost immediately about the color, smell, and taste of what was coming out of their taps. Officials failed to apply the corrosion control treatment required by federal law, and the more corrosive river water began eating through the protective lining inside decades-old lead pipes throughout the city. Somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 children were exposed to elevated lead levels during the crisis, a toxic metal with no safe level of exposure, capable of causing permanent developmental harm in growing kids. At the same time, a spike in Legionnaire's disease swept through Genesee County, ultimately linked to 12 confirmed deaths, including an 85-year-old man named Robert Skidmore, whose death became central to a criminal manslaughter charge against the state's own health department director. Officials later admitted they'd known about the outbreak for months before telling the public, choosing instead to quietly investigate while residents kept drinking the water. 15 people eventually faced criminal charges tied to the crisis. Only one was ever convicted. The city finally switched back to the Detroit water system in October of 2015, and 2 years after that, signed a 30-year contract with the newly formed Great Lakes Water Authority to make sure a single emergency manager could never again make that decision alone. Even so, it took until 2025, more than a decade after that first switch to the Flint River, for the crisis to be formally considered resolved. A city of under 100,000 people, mostly working class, majority black, was handed poisoned water by the government meant to protect it, watched its own emergency manager make the decision without a public vote, and was then largely ignored while children's blood lead levels climbed. Flint isn't hated because its people did anything wrong. Flint is hated because it became the clearest, most painful proof this country has produced in decades that when a government decides to cut costs, it's the most vulnerable people who end up paying for it. That's the countdown. 12 Michigan towns, 12 completely different reasons for the reputation each one carries. Smuggled whiskey and a collapsed budget, stolen streetlights and a stolen neighborhood, a cult, a psychiatric experiment, a suburb's hidden scorecard, and a water crisis the whole country is still talking about. What strikes me putting a list like this together is how differently each of these towns got here, some through decades of neglect, some through a single bad decision made in a boardroom hundreds of miles away, and at least one through pure stubborn bad luck at the wrong end of a pipeline. None of them asked for the reputation they're stuck with. If this kept you watching to the end, subscribe and tell me which entry hit hardest, because there's at least 6 more states worth of towns like these coming, and your comments help decide where I go next.